So let's go ahead and jump in, having a week here that next week I begin this new sermon series. I had 1 week here where I could share anything that I wanted to share. And I just started out this week, and I'm just going to be honest with you, it's been a challenging few weeks for me personally. 2 weeks ago, I had a back spasm. Now, I had fusion surgeries in 2020, and I had a back spasm, and this one was a doozy. It really put me out. Really, for the last couple of weeks, I've been still recovering from the effects of it. And then to add on to that, on Tuesday, still recovering from my back spasm, I was eating dinner and started having terrible pain in my mouth. By bedtime, an abscess so large that I couldn't close my mouth had opened in my jaw, and off to the emergency room I went again. A side note, the Silverton emergency room, the new one, is so nice. You can thank me for that, okay? Because there's a wing there that's named after me. A lot of you know that in 2009, I had an accident that's led to living with chronic pain. And so when I have these other things added on to it, it can feel really quickly like I've spiraled out of control. And the enemy has tried to use my pain to shut me down and close me off from connecting with others. Pain often does that. We look inside when we're in pain. And see, the last thing I want, to be honest, is more sympathy or more attention when it comes to pain. So my choice often is just to keep it to myself. And I've heard the enemy say to me so many times, who are you to preach this message? Who are you to talk about healing? Who are you to talk about the goodness of God or the kindness of God? And see, friends, one of the things that I just keep coming back to, I've told my wife repeatedly that this is a verse I just cling to, is 2 Corinthians 12, 8 through 9. And what Paul tells me and tells us has just become so critical for me in this process. And he says, 3 different times I begged the Lord to take it away. And each time he said, my grace is all you need, because my power works best in weakness. So now I'm glad to boast about my weakness so that the power of Christ can work through me. And so as I read this, what it tells me is I'm not going to stay quiet. I'm not going to allow the enemy to have any victory in the difficulty that I'm experiencing. And so last week, I was sitting on the bench. I was planning on preaching last week. After my back spasm, my dad graciously stepped up and just preached such an awesome message last week, one that I needed to hear. And in fact, he started off the message with one of my all-time favorite quotes from one of my all-time favorite authors, from Tozer. And the quote he shared was this one: what comes to your mind when you think about God is the most important thing about you, because it affects everything else in your life. And as I was sitting there moping to myself about my circumstances, I was reminded once again that what was I believing, what was I thinking about God in that moment? And it actually reminded me of another Tozer quote that I love, and it's this one: a low view of God is the cause of hundreds of lesser evils. A high view of God is the solution to 10,000 temporal problems. And I actually believe that this is true. See, I believe one of the biggest problems that we face, isn't our circumstances. It's not the doctor's diagnosis. It's not the family trouble. It's not the failing business. Now, understand, I'm not making light of your difficulty. I certainly don't want to minimize the overwhelming challenges that you or I may be facing. But again, in those circumstances, I want to make sure we keep a godly perspective. And so I just have to ask this question to myself and to you today: are your problems bigger than God, or is God bigger than your problems? Question is, how big is your God? Is God big enough to heal your marriage? Is God big enough to heal your children? Is he big enough to be over your positive MRI results or your negative evaluation? Is he big enough to be working in ways that maybe in the moment you can't see and understand? So what I want to do with this message today is I want to unpack the experience of a man in the Bible who had more questions and suffering than anyone else. And his name has actually become synonymous with us, with suffering and with questions. And his name is Job. Now, If you're new to the Bible, maybe you called him Job, but his name is Job, okay? It's spelled J-O-B, so I get the confusion. But his name is Job, and he's one of 3 books in the Old Testament that's considered a book of wisdom. There are 3 Hebrew books considered the books of wisdom, the book of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. And today we're going to be in chapter 38 of the book of Job primarily, but I want to actually give you an overview of chapter 1 through 37 because the story won't make sense otherwise. Now, Job is such a different book in the Bible because actually we don't know what time period the book of Job even takes place in. In fact, we don't even know what nationality Job was. Now, many scholars believe that the book of Job is actually the oldest book in the Bible, and there's several clues throughout the text that lead them to that thinking. They believe it was written at the time of the patriarchs. That's the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And if that's true, that's more than 400 years before Moses would write down the Pentateuch, those first 5 books of the Bible. So this ancient book of wisdom, all we know for sure is this. The prologue, Job 1:1, starts like this. There once was a man named Job who lived in the land of Uz. He was blameless, a man of complete integrity. He feared God and he stayed away from evil. In fact, it goes on to tell us more about this guy, Job. It tells us that he was extremely wealthy. Not just wealthy, it says he was the most wealthy in all of the East. And it tells us he was rich and wealthy in every way. He was rich in family. He was rich with his children. He was rich with his reputation, with his herds. He was wealthy in every different measurable way. And actually, then it gives us little antidotes to show us just how devoted a believer Job was. It tells us that Job's kids used to have parties at their house. And when they'd have their friends over and when they'd have a party, after the party was over, Job would sacrifice to the Lord to make sure that no one at the party had cursed the Lord in their heart while they were at his house. Okay? So he's incredibly devout in his following of God. But right after this little brief prologue introduction, we're swept off into heaven, where God is apparently having a staff meeting. And among the crowd who's present at the staff meeting, someone named Satan, or the Satan, is there. His name in Hebrew literally means the accuser or the adversary. It translated directly, it would be the one who is opposed or the one who obstructs. And here's the scene, Job 1, 9 through 12. One day the members of the heavenly court came to present themselves before the Lord, and the accuser, Satan, came with them. Where have you come from, the Lord asked Satan. Satan answered the Lord, I've been patrolling the earth, watching everything that's going on. Then the Lord asked Satan, have you noticed my servant Job? He's the finest man in all the earth. He's blameless, a man of complete integrity. He fears God and stays away from evil. Satan replied to the Lord, yes, but Job has good reason to fear God. You have always put a wall of protection around him and his home and his property. You have made him prosper in everything he does. Look how rich he is. But reach out and take away everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. So verse 12, God says, all right, you may test him. The Lord said to Satan, do whatever you want with everything he possesses, but don't harm him physically. So Satan left the Lord's presence. And for the next 2 chapters, that's exactly what happens. Satan takes everything and everyone away from Job, well, except for his wife, whose advice to Job is, you should curse God and die. So maybe you can see why Satan left her alone. But even after he loses everything, Job continues in this amazing scene to praise the Lord. The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. He's praising the Lord. So another staff meeting takes place, and Satan is back at the staff meeting again. And he's pointed out that Job is still praising. And he says, well, yeah, of course he's still praising. You won't let me hurt him physically. And as soon as he's hurt physically, he'll immediately curse you. And so God says, you cannot kill him. But he's allowed to harm Job physically, and he gives Job these painful boils from head to toe. And at this point in the story, us readers should be asking this important question. Wait, What? Why on earth would any of this be allowed? And then what we would expect is the rest of the book of Job answers that question that Job has and that we, the readers, have. But guess what? That's not what we get. In fact, in chapter 3, Job's friends enter the story, Eliphaz, Zophar, and Bildad. And they come to try to help Job understand his suffering. Now, for what it's worth, these friends are amazing. They sit with Job for 7 days without speaking. For 7 days, they're just there for their friend. No one says a word. It's actually Job who eventually breaks the silence with this poem, which, by the way, one of the things we lose in the book of Job is this whole book is ancient Hebrew poetry. It's just beautiful ancient poetry, but in the English translation, we lose that. But here, this poem begins by Job, and this poem does not start off so happy. Here's Job's beginning in verse 3 of chapter 3. Let the day of my birth be erased, and the night I was conceived. I wish I was never born. And after this, and after Job's lament, his friends begin to speak up. His friends begin to try to answer the question, why did this happen? Why is Job suffering? What is behind, what is the cause of all of this difficulty? And basically their arguments are all the same. Their arguments, one at a time, in these big, long speeches filled with poetry, are, Job, you gotta think of the reason, because we know God is just and we know everything happens for a reason. It's cause and effect. And so you need to think hard about what you've done that's caused this to happen. And Job over and over again pushes back at this. He says, I'm not a perfect person, but nothing that I've done could possibly warrant any of this. And this goes back and forth, back and forth. Each friend takes their turn. And 37 chapters of speeches and poems are the next part of the book. Eventually, another young man appears, Elihu, who shows up to the party, and he takes his shot. The old guys have shared their wisdom, and now the young guy is going to share his wisdom. But at the end of all of this sharing, Job still has no answers. And then finally, in chapter 38, God shows up. And you and I might say, at last, Job is going to get some answers. But that's not what happens. God shows up, and he starts asking Job a bunch of questions. Job 38, verse 1 through 3. Then the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind, who is this that questions my wisdom with such ignorant words? Brace yourself like a man, because I have some questions for you, and you must answer them. So God starts to ask questions, 64 questions to be exact. He asks some things like this. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you know so much. Who determined its dimensions and stretched out the surveying line? What supports its foundations, and who laid its cornerstone? As the morning star sang together and all the angels shouted for joy. God asked Job some amazing questions. Verse 26, who makes the rain fall on barren land, in a desert where no one lives? Who sends rain to satisfy the parched ground and make the tender grass spring up? I love this aspect of God's creation. God's creation's not like a Hollywood movie set where it only looks good on the outside, but once you get around the back, you notice that it's really, just all a facade. In fact, the more we are able to see in depth of God's creation, the more we realize it's even grander, more amazing, more wonderful, more beautiful than we ever could have imagined. Just picture this. For thousands of years of human existence, no one had ever seen another planet. No one had ever seen or knew of another galaxy. No one had ever seen a cell or DNA or a protein. No one ever knew those existed. But God, in his detail, made all of these things infinitely complex. I love to think about what discoveries await us because we think we know a lot more than we do. Job 38, 31 through 33. Can you direct the movement of the stars? Binding the clusters of the Pleiades or loosening the cords of Orion? Can you direct the constellations through the seasons or guide the bear with her cubs across the heavens? Do you know the laws of the universe? Can you use them to regulate the earth? There's even some really random questions in here. He asks Job some questions that I find hilarious. He asks Job about the reproduction habits of goats in chapter 39. He asks him why ostriches look the way that they do in chapter 39, verse 13. And you might read it and think, I understand the big questions about the universe, but why is God asking him questions like these? See, because what God is doing is he's challenging Job's perspective. See, Job and his friends had this assumption that they were working off, that if God had a reason, they were wise enough to get it. If God had a reason, then they were smart enough and they knew enough to fully understand and hold court on God. And God is showing Job that their perspective on the world's not nearly big enough. If they can't understand simple things like constellation creation or ostrich design, how are they possibly going to hold court on God? And so in chapter 40, God says, "Then the Lord said to Job, 'Do you still want to argue with the Almighty? You are God's critic, but do you have the answers?'" And really the climax of God's argument comes in chapter 42, verse 3. "Who is this that dares question my judgment without knowledge?" You see, we have this problem. Humanity, our philosophers call this problem the problem of evil. Now, this problem of evil first was stated by Epicurus, but friends, I think you find it right here in the book of Job. And the problem of evil, we say it something like this: if God is all loving and if God is all powerful, then why is there so much suffering in the world? Anyone ever? Right? Okay, this is a common line of thinking. But see, here's the problem with this line of thinking. This line of thinking comes from the assumption that if there was a reason for it, I'd be able to understand it. I'd be able to see it. And if I can't, then there must not be a reason. See, because at the root of this kind of thinking is a total understanding about how big God is versus me. How big his wisdom, how big his power, how big his understanding is compared to mine. So, this was a message that I love to give. I'm a total nerd for this kind of stuff, and since I have the microphone, you get to come along with me for a journey. Because real quick, I want to actually help some of you, because this helps me immensely in thinking about how big is God really in comparison to me. So let's just really quick think about how much power it would have taken God to make our known universe. How much power must our God have? I'm glad you asked. Astronomers estimate that the number of stars in the sky above us is more than 3 septillion. And that number expands by more than 31.5 million new stars born every year. 3 septillion and growing. Now, here's the number 3 septillion if you want to see it. That's 3 with 24 zeros after it. Another way to say this number is 3 trillion, okay? So if you're like me, big numbers are hard. Anyone else? Big numbers are hard. When we say million, billion, trillion, they all sound like just big numbers, but really what do they mean? Well, 1 million seconds ago. Does anyone know what they were doing 1 million seconds ago? Because that was just 11 days ago. On January 22nd, it was 1 million seconds. So if I started handing you $1 a second on the 22nd of January, today, congratulations, you'd be a millionaire. So what about 1 billion seconds ago? It can't be that much more than 1 million, right? Because 1 billion is, we know people on the earth that have $1 billion, so 1 billion must not be much more than 1 million. So how long ago was 1 billion seconds ago? That was 31 years and 8 months ago. If I handed you $1 a second, 24 hours a day, it would take me 31 years and 8 months for you to become a billionaire. That was Saturday, June 2nd, 1993, at the height of the Bill Clinton scandal, okay? That's 1 billion seconds ago. How about 1 trillion seconds ago? Because 1 trillion can't be that much bigger than 1 billion, right? Maybe 1,000 years or a couple of centuries back. How long do you think 1 trillion seconds ago was? trillion seconds ago was 31,709 years. That's the year 29,684 BC. What about a septillion seconds? Does anyone want to start counting? Because if you started counting today and you could count at one number per second, 24 hours a day, it would only take you 31 quadrillion, 709 trillion, 791 billion, 983 million, 764,586 years to count to one septillion. Now think of this. There's at least 3 septillion stars in the sky above us. And each one puts out roughly the same amount of energy as 1 trillion atomic bombs every second. And God made them with a single word. I'm a huge nerd for this kind of stuff. Here's a picture of our solar system. And there we are, Earth, third rock from the sun, sitting a perfect 93 million miles away from our favorite star. Our solar system is huge. It's so big that measurements like feet and meters and miles and kilometers don't work for our experiment any longer. So we've got to use a new measurement, one called a light year. Now, light moves along at 670 million miles per hour. That's a big number to wrap your mind around. So this might help you. I fly a direct flight from Portland to Amsterdam when I travel to Poland or Ukraine. That direct flight on my jet cruising at 600 miles per hour takes me 9 hours and 30 minutes to fly 5,016 miles. If I could travel that at the speed of light, that same trip from Portland to Amsterdam would take 0.0269 seconds. That is 15 times faster than the blink of an eye. So light moves really, really fast. A light year is the distance that you would travel at the speed of light in 365 days. So if you were flying the speed of light for 1 Earth year, that distance would be a light year, or 5.88 trillion miles. And if you could fly at the speed of light and you wanted to visit the outer edge of our solar system, it would take you 2 years to get to the end. Now that's big. Or is it? Our solar system is just one of 100 billion known solar systems that make up our Milky Way galaxy. We're in the middle there somewhere, but there couldn't be a spot small enough in that picture for you to see our solar system, because if we wanted to compare our solar system to our Milky Way galaxy, if we shrunk our solar system, that's 2 light years across, to the size of a quarter, that quarter would be, in comparison, the size of continental North America, Canada, the US, and Mexico, compared to a quarter, and that's our Milky Way galaxy. The Milky Way is huge, and it's made up of more than 400 billion stars, each with their own solar system. Friends, if you wanted to travel from one end of the Milky Way to the other, it'd take you more than 100,000 years flying at the speed of light. Now that's big. Or is it? See this picture here? Those are all galaxies like our Milky Way galaxy. Our Milky Way is one of just 350 billion galaxies that we puny humans have observed so far. Here's how Isaiah puts it for us. Isaiah 40, 12 through 14. Who else has held the ocean in his hand? Who has measured off the heavens with his fingers? Who else knows the weight of the earth, or has weighed the mountains and hills on the scale? Who is able to advise the Spirit of the Lord? Who knows enough to give him advice or to teach him? Has the Lord ever needed anyone's advice? Does he need instruction about what is good? Did someone teach him what is right or show him the path of justice? Now down to verse 26. Look up at the heavens. Who created the stars? He brings them out like an army, one after another, calling each by its name. Because of his great power and incomparable strength, not a single one is missing. O Jacob, How can you say the Lord does not see your troubles? O Israel, how can you say God ignores your rights? Have you never heard? Have you never understood? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of all the earth. He never grows weak or weary. No one can measure the depths of his understanding. Wow. He's big. He can measure all of it with his fingers. He can measure off the heavens. He knows each of the 3 septillion stars by name. My mom has 3 children. And she cannot keep our names straight. It's true. And he calls each of the 3 septillion stars by name. And he created all of them in one breath, in a single moment, with a single word. Friends, our sun is just a mid-sized star. Our sun produces 380 septillion watts of power every second. That means that 1 second of the sun's energy is enough to power the earth for 21 trillion years. Now let's compare that to my power real quick. The other day, I had to put a fitted mattress on my bed. And after it, my heart was racing. My watch notified me, good job, I had done a workout. Last week, I turned in my car to help my daughter in the back seat with her seatbelt, and I had a back spasm. I love to watch the Tour de France, and one of the things in the tour that they show you on TV in real time is the power output of the athletes on their bikes in watts, the power that the athletes can produce. And the peak, top, most drug-fueled endurance athletes in the world can produce 500 watts of peak power. 500 watts, that's amazing. That is 4 cents worth of power from PGE. Has enough power to power your laptop for 1 hour. Our output and God's output simply don't measure up. And so, friends, if his wisdom and his power is as high above mine as my limited wisdom and power, the only rational conclusion that we can come to is there will be things in this life and things in this world that we will not have an immediate answer to understand. Isaiah says it like this. Isaiah 55, 8 through 9. My thoughts are nothing like your thoughts, says the Lord. My ways are far beyond anything you can imagine. For just as the heavens are higher than the earth, so my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts are higher than your thoughts. Friends, what he's saying is it's entirely possible that God could be working a beautiful, wonderful, good plan in your life, and you and I just might not see it yet. Isn't it arrogant of us to assume with our limited knowledge and understanding that we could in real time perceive and understand everything that God was doing in our life? See, Job, in response to hearing all this, he says it like this, Job 42, 3 through 5. Then Job replied to the Lord, I am nothing. How could I ever find the answers? I will cover my mouth with my hand. I have said too much already. I have nothing more to say. In case you missed it, Job is saying, I didn't realize just how limited my perspective really was. I didn't realize how big you really are. I didn't realize the posture that I had taken in my questions. Friends, God invites us to ask our questions. You hear me talk about this a lot. But friends, we have to ask those questions from a posture that understands just how big, just how powerful, just how kind, just how good the God whom we are asking our questions to really is. You see, Job wanted answers, but God gave Job something far, far better than answers. He gave Job something far, far, far more sustaining than answers. Instead of answers, he got presence. Job got to have an encounter with the living God. And when he encountered the presence of God, it changed everything in an instant. Because more than any answers to any questions could ever do, when God's presence came, Job was immediately changed. He was immediately satisfied. Keep in mind, God is going, if you know the end of the story, sometimes we read this as because we already know the end. God restores Job. In fact, sevenfold he restores Job. But that hasn't happened yet. Job has not received that yet. So in real time, you see, as Job has lost everything, when God shows up, he's satisfied. Job 42:6, I take back everything I said, and I sit in the dust and ashes to show my repentance. Job's repenting. He's repenting because now that he has seen God, now that he has had this encounter with God, he recognizes that God's beauty, his majesty, his power, his wonder was far better than any of the questions that he had. And friends, this has been the experience of countless people as they struggled and suffered throughout history. One of my favorites, my heroes, Corrie ten Boom. And she who lived in a Nazi prison camp during World War II, whose father and sister both died in that camp. She wrote this: no matter how deep our darkness, God is deeper still. You see, to be able to say this, you have to have an understanding, an experience of God's presence and his bigness that goes beyond your circumstances. In fact, we come back to Tozer. Tozer said, when I view life through the lens, a low view of God is the cause of hundreds of lesser evils. A high view of God is a solution to 10,000 temporal problems. See, what happens is, friends, when I view life through the lens of my problems, when I let my problems and my pain take first position to be what I look at God with, what I interpret life with, what I view Scripture with, what I look at everything else with, when I focus through my pain and through my suffering, I'm always going to question, why God? I'll always be trapped. I'll always be stuck. I'll always be frustrated. On the flip side, if I let the lens in which I view my suffering be the truth of God's goodness, his kindness, his greatness, his enormity, then how I view my life and my problems begins to change. Again, let's go back to Corrie. This is what she said. If you look at the world, you'll be distressed. If you look within, you'll be depressed. And if you look at God, you'll be at rest. You see, friends, for many of us, and I fall into this trap regularly, our problem is that our eyes are on ourselves, on our pain, on our circumstances, or our eyes are on someone else's pain and circumstances. And friends, what ends up taking place is we begin questioning the goodness of God based on what we think we know and think we see, instead of coming back to this wonderful truth that God's presence is more than enough. And in God's presence, there is provision and power and help available to us that far exceeds our temporary circumstance. In fact, in God, he can use our temporary circumstance even for our good. It's uniquely something that he's able to do because of who he is. Band, you guys can come back up. I have two more scriptures I'm planning to share with you today. And I want to read these for you. But I really want to take the time today as well to just acknowledge that there are people who are in this room right now, like me, who are dealing with a lot of things physically, dealing with a lot of things emotionally, dealing with circumstances and situations where you, like Job, have been in a place maybe for a long time that this question, why, just won't go away. Why God? Why God? And where the Lord invites you, because actually at the end of this story, the three friends, God has something to say to them about the advice that they gave Job. But to Job, he doesn't have any problem with Job wrestling. He doesn't have any problem with you wrestling with the question why. But friends, I have help available to you today because his presence is available to you and I. And when you encounter his presence, when you really truly see how big he is and how good he is. Dad, just last week, that's the message that he preached about really believing in the goodness of God. When you come to this place where you understand that his goodness is real and it's true, and his bigness, friends, he's enormous. And if the same God, go back to what Isaiah told us, if that God who can measure the heavens with his fingers, then we can't say he's unaware of what we're going through. We can't say that he doesn't care because he's present, because he proved it on the cross as Jesus laid down his life for us so that there would be nothing that separated us from his love. Friends, today you can ask him your questions, but even better than your questions, because no matter what answer you get, you'll still wrestle. Something far more sustaining to you than the answers is his presence, and it's available to you today. That you would see God and know God. That he would minister to you in your circumstances today. And my prayer would be that you would have an experience like what Job had, where you'd come to this place and you'd actually be able to just worship the Lord. You'd be able to say, God, I'm praising you because I was asking the wrong question. I didn't see how good you were. I didn't see how big you were. I didn't see how present you had been in my life. And so God, regardless of what I think I know or think I see, I'm going to praise you today. That power is not just something that God has. It's something that he puts to work in, for, and through us. How much power did it take God to make that universe that we talked about? A lot. Now listen to this, 2 Peter 1, 3-4. By his divine power, God has given us everything we need for a godly life. We have received all of this by coming to know him, the one who called us to himself by means of his marvelous glory and excellence. And because of his glory and excellence, he has given us great and precious promises. These are the promises that enable you to share his divine nature and escape the world's corruption caused by our human desires. Ephesians 1, 18-20. I pray that your hearts would be flooded with light so that you can understand the confident hope he has given to those he called, his holy people who are his rich and glorious inheritance. I pray that you will understand the incredible greatness of God's power for us who believe in him. This is the same mighty power that raised Christ from the dead and seated him in the place of honor at God's right hand in the heavenly realms. That power of God, the same power that stretched out the universe, the same power that raised Jesus from the dead, is present amongst us in and through the person of the Holy Spirit, residing in us who believe. And his desire for you today is for you to have an experience of his presence that goes beyond your questions why, and actually brings you to the place that Job was able to come, where he said, oh God, regardless of what happens in my life, I praise you.